thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Miriam Brett. I am a co-director at Future Economy Scotland. We are here this evening to talk about how to maximise the benefits of Scotland's offshore wind. Scotland's ScotWind offshore leasing ground has the potential to be a major boom for Scotland's economy while helping us transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And with the first round of leases now under development and underway, this is a really critical time to examine how offshore wind projects can maximise supply chain growth, maximise job creation, as well as looking at some of the wider considerations around how to maximise the impact of offshore wind for the wider economy, for the taxpayer, and for communities. I'm not going to speak for that much longer because I'm keen to hear from our lineup of expert speakers, but just to let you know about the structure of the evening, so we will be hearing from each of our speakers in turn, who will speak for around 10 minutes each, and then we will have plenty of time for a Q&A with the audience. To let you know that if you have any questions throughout the event, please just put them in the Q&A box, and we'll return to those at the Q&A section. So do that as we kind of go along, as questions come to you, and please ask as many questions as you like, and we're always keen for as much engagement as possible. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic speakers this evening. The first up is Kateryna McKinnon. Kateryna is Development Manager in the Offshore Wind Development team at Crown Estate Scotland. She joined Crown Estate Scotland in 2022, having previously worked for the Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Educated in Ukraine as an economist, Kateryna has worked in economic development in Scotland for 17 years, and her experience spans across research and economics, energy and supply chain development, and many other areas alongside that. She currently focuses on managing a portfolio of seabed options to lease agreements for offshore wind, including pre-ScotWind, ScotWind and INTOG innovation projects. So without further ado, we'd love to hear your remarks, Kateryna. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Hello and good evening, everyone, from a very sunny and warm Edinburgh. It's brilliant to see the sun tonight. So first of all, thank you very much to Miriam and the team at Future Economy Scotland for the invitation to join this webinar. So delighted to join it. As Miriam mentioned, so my name is Kateryna McKinnon and I am Development Manager with the Offshore Wind team at Crown Estate Scotland. So my role focuses on managing a portfolio of seabed option to lease agreements for the project spanning across ScotWind, INTOG, and also a small number of projects from the earlier leasing rounds. So all these projects are still under development at various stages. So I think I have about 10 minutes to talk to you briefly about the role of Crown Estate Scotland in enabling the offshore wind sector development, and also to answer a couple of more specific questions on, first of all, how to maximise the economic opportunities for Scotland from offshore wind, and also any lessons learned, I guess, to date for the future. So to kick off, to briefly explain our role, at Crown Estate Scotland, we manage a portfolio of assets, so both at land and at sea, and right of the Crown. And now, to dispel any doubts, we do not work for the King. However, the assets are held in the name of the Crown. We are actually Scottish Public Corporation. We report to Scottish ministers, although we have also our independent board. Ultimately, the assets that we manage are managed on behalf of the Scottish people and with the aim to generate sustainable, lasting value for Scotland. We are a self-funding body, so this is very distinct from other public sector bodies. We contribute significantly to the Scottish economy. The surplus revenues that we generate through, for example, leasing such as option fees, and also through rent once the assets are operational, all of this goes to Scottish Government for public spending. So clearly, Crown Estate Scotland has a core role to play in the offshore wind sector development. primarily, this is around creating opportunities for developers to access the seabed. So we do this through awarding and managing seabed leases, largely via structured leasing rounds, such as ScotWind and INTOG. So our leasing follows a plan-led approach, where Scottish Government provides the spatial planning framework, the sector and marine plan for offshore wind energy. The current plan is now being updated, and this will deliver the planning framework for ScotWind and INTOG project. This is expected to be finalized in autumn 2025, so later this year, and then with the plan adoption soon thereafter. I'm sure a long-awaited moment for the industry. To make it clear, any future leasing rounds or any applications for seabed property rights for offshore wind will be considered in light of the adoption of the sector marine plan. And there are currently no plans for further leasing of offshore wind in Scotland, since the focus is very much on the delivery of the current pipeline. We do have a lot to go on right now. Through both ScotWind and INTOG leasing rounds, in addition to those pre-ScotWind projects I mentioned, Scotland has the opportunity to deliver a pipeline of around 40 gigawatts of electricity. This is a massive pipeline, and this is on top of already operational 3 gigawatt that we have, and another 1.3 that is installed and is soon to become fully operational this summer. So this is really a very significant pipeline, and also the largest pipeline in the world of commercial scale floating wind, around 24 gigawatt. So a lot of for us to be done, and a lot of projects to be delivered. And all these projects do create significant economic opportunities for Scotland, which is the topic of discussion today. So in terms of our direct role at Crown Estate Scotland in maximising the opportunity through these projects, we mandated the projects to submit an overview of their supply chain commitments in the way of a supply chain development statement, SCDS. We like our acronym. So the ScotWind, for ScotWind, this amounted to an average Scottish supply chain commitment per project of around £1.5 billion, and across all 20 projects. The requirement was mandated very much from the outset through the leasing rounds, although it wasn't scored as part of the competition, but the requirement was very much to ensure the focus on the supply chain from the early stage on supply chain capacity to develop and deliver these projects. So just maybe to explain briefly how they work, in case people don't know. So these SCDS submissions, the projects were required to provide a breakdown of expenditure by geography and by the project stage in development, fabrication, construction, and longer-term operations. There's also a company narrative to go with the numbers to provide commentary around specific supply chain opportunities. There are two sets of figures, or actually four. So we've got a public version, Outlook, which is on our website, and then a more detailed confidential information for Crown Estate Scotland's eyes only. So within that, there are two sets of figures. We have commitment figures. So this is the expenditure that each project is contractually committing to through their seabed option agreement. And then there's a figure for project ambition. So this is the potential opportunity from the project, which builds on the commitments and then identifies opportunities for potential greater expenditure across specific supply chain categories. This information is there to provide early visibility of the opportunities, but also particularly the confidential part of the submission is to inform the economic development in Scotland. So at Crown Estate Scotland, we engage with each project regularly, usually quarterly, and this is to ensure that progress is being achieved and that contractual milestones are being met. SCDS are updated on a regular basis, but no less than every 3 years, and also they will be updated upon stepping through to lease. this is also verified by evidence of contractual expenditure made by the project. There are financial remedies if the commitments are not met, or indeed it could be that in the worst case scenario, non-compliance, it could mean that the project cannot progress to the lease. What we have seen on the back of these early stage commitments is that there's been a lot of engagement and very positive examples of collaboration already taken place through, for example, the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, SOWEC collaborative framework, and also through the Strategic Investment Model, the SIM, another acronym. And the SIM work aims to support early and strategic investment across key areas of the supply chain, such as ports, fabrication, for example. Another example is the Industrial Growth Plan, the IGP, at the UK level. So Crown Estate Scotland has worked with key industry bodies throughout the process, and that was published last year. So the plan aims to maximise the impact of strategic supply chain investments and also to prioritise collective efforts on specific areas where UK has particular strengths. I think Emma might probably talk more on the specifics of that, but indeed it's a very good example of collaboration. However, I think in order to realise any of these investments into the supply chain, to create local jobs, first and foremost, we need to make the projects happen. For example, through accelerating consenting. Projects such as Berwickbank, West of Orkney, these have been with the Scottish ministers for quite some time for consideration, and I think we need to get these determined soon. I realise the importance of robust assessments of the impacts and also the likelihood of the need for compensatory measures because of the scale of the impact, and to ensure that these developments happen in balance with the protection of our environment and other marine users. However, timely determination is very much key to enable investment, to continue the investment into development, but also those investments in the supply chain as well. We need to accelerate grid developments, not a surprise there. However, the scale is enormous across Scotland and the wider UK, and because we need to bring that electricity to the market, to consumer. Within that, communities' acceptance will be key. They need to be engaged throughout every stage. They need to be on board. They need to have the opportunity to influence, for example, the design of the infrastructure, both offshore and onshore. Communities also need to see the real benefits of these developments. There's been quite a lot of discussion on this, and not least it'll be interesting to see the outcomes of the recent Scottish Government's consultation on best practices for offshore wind, for community benefits from offshore wind. So ultimately, we also need to ensure that the Scottish projects are competitive through addressing some of the regulatory and policy challenges, be it on the way, be it the way transmission charging is apportioned and distributed across the UK, and in particular that quite often disproportionately impacts Scottish projects, or indeed the wider route to market mechanisms as well, in particular regarding the floating offshore wind sector, which is still in its early nascent stages and needs to scale up commercially. In terms of the lessons learned, I'm sure there are quite a few from what we've done to date. We've been here for quite some time. I think we've learned that the grid network planning has to take place alongside the leasing processes in terms of where, when, and how much capacity needs to be developed. This is indeed intention through the development of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, for example, and also the Centralised Strategic Network Plan. Again, acronyms SSEP and CSNP. So these are very important to ensure that alignment and this strategic approach to future developments across the UK. And then there is the whole of seabed project led by the Crown Estate, and we are also involved in this. And this aims to align the future development across different marine sectors and includes also nature as a separate sector there. So we need to build on the collaboration that we have. As I say, we have seen increased alignment there and between government and industry through the processes such as SIM, IGP, and indeed the creation of Great British Energy, and also the very recent announcement to invest 300 million specifically in the offshore wind supply chain development aligned to the IGP priorities is a very positive news story. So I think there is undoubtedly a very clear recognition that the projects have challenges, they have headwinds across these various areas, and it is difficult, in particular around the floating space, since we're trying to create this new industry. But we need to remain being bold, ambitious, and all parties to remain committed to delivering this in collaboration. So this is me. Hope I rattled through the 10 minutes allocated.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really useful to hear. I think it's useful to hear the kind of nuts and bolts of how it all works at Crown Estate Scotland and the way that it all functions. And really useful as well to touch upon some of the kind of regulatory challenges like transmission charges that you mentioned, as well as some of the kind of wider aims around community engagement and influence. I'm going to turn to our next speaker now. So we are very pleased to be joined by Ewan Gibbs. So Ewan is a senior lecturer in economic and social history at Glasgow University. He's a historian of energy, industry, work and protest in Scotland and Britain. Ewan's first book, Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialisation in Post-War Scotland, was published by the University of London Press in 2021. In 2024, Ewan co-authored a report with Ryoko Shib on the Grangemouth refinery closure for the Just Transition Commission. He's also published research on why Scotland hasn't achieved the advances in wind manufacturing which governments have hoped for. So I'm going to turn to Ewan now. Thank you very much for joining us, Ewan.
Thank you very much. I think the core question behind this seminar was a question about maximising benefit from wind energy generation. And I guess I think it's worth starting by thinking about what those benefits are and who they would be for or should be for and are for at the moment. So I think initially we can start with a positive story, which is that, we have seen in the last 10 years, a massive expansion of decarbonised electricity production, and specifically wind-based renewable electricity production. So low carbon and renewable energy by 2022 accounted for 113% of Scottish electricity demand. That's a major achievement. It's been accompanied with the phasing out of coal. When I started writing about Scotland's energy economy and doing research on the intersections of energy and labour history in 2013, 2014, we still had a large coal power station in Scotland. It's also been accompanied by the closure of a large nuclear power station as well. Scotland has higher renewable output than most EU countries, despite being much smaller in population terms. I think, though, there's an important story to tell of ambiguities here and areas where achievements haven't been made. Comparisons have been made by politicians between Scotland and Saudi Arabia when it came to renewables and renewables wealth and Saudi Arabia's oil wealth. There were very ambitious projections made in both 2010 and more recently in 2022 for manufacturing. Around the time of the first ScotWind auction, Nicola Sturgeon spoke about an offshore wind industry that might employ 30,000 people by 2030. And considerable hopes have been invested that North Sea employment, carbon-intensive energy employment in Scotland would be replaced by wind energy. That's obviously particularly important this month when we see that the Grangemouth oil refinery is closed down 400 direct redundancies, perhaps up to 3,000 in the wider supply chain, just dependent on refining at Grangemouth. I think an important question that also hangs over this story, which we're not really going to have time to address in this seminar, but shouldn't be out of our mind, is consumer benefits. That we've overseen this huge expansion of cheap green electrical production, and yet we're paying record energy fees, energy bills in Scotland, and we should be questioning why we aren't gaining from the development of our resources in that way. I want to start then by making the provocation that regulation of our energy matters, absolutely, but who owns and controls our energy matters over and above everything else. And I think it's true that in Scotland and across the UK, the attitude to the development of offshore wind has been overwhelmingly to see it as an opportunity for inward investment by the privatised companies that replaced our publicly owned utilities in the 1980s and 1990s. Yes, investment by multinationals from other countries, but also investment from foreign governments. The Irish government, the French government, the Danish government, the Norwegian government, among others, own significant portions of our emerging wind sector in Scotland. And I think it's also very important that we are now thinking about wind generation, not as an important opportunity for the future, but as a live sector in Scotland, which is a major contributor to our energy economy, but which is not necessarily living up to the expectations of industrial performance that were hung on it in the early 21st century. In 2022, low carbon and renewable energy in Scotland employed around 25 to 26,000 people, which was up only from 23,400 in 2014. Offshore wind specifically, and these are figures from the ONS, I should say, was static at around 1,000 from 2019 to 22. In the UK as a whole, offshore wind manufacturing only increased from 1,000 to below 4,000 from 2014 to 2022. And in Scotland, offshore renewable energy manufacturing as a whole accounted for less than 3,000 jobs in the early 2020s. I think that's particularly important because wind is a capital-intensive sector. Wind isn't like coal mining or oil and gas production where you need a large workforce to actually generate electricity. So the jobs, if they're going to be created, if we're going to create well-paid, sustained industrial jobs, would lie in manufacturing. But at the moment, the UK's performance lags behind its North Sea neighbours. The UK, with Scotland at the vanguard of the development of offshore wind in the UK, is a major net importer of wind equipment. So there's a lack of investment in manufacturing supply chain and a high dependence on imported material as a result of that. Under 40% of the supply chain value connected to the previous round of ScotWind was expected to be spent within Scotland. Still, the STUC in Transition Economics, so the Scottish Trade Union Movement, in a report published recently, estimated that there was potential for up to 20,000 jobs in fabrication from that level of investment if it was forthcoming. I think we need to have a frank discussion about what's been achieved here. And it does concern me that one of the ramifications of the way that these options work is we then have relatively secret developments of oversight and argument between regulators and companies. I think at the end of the day, they should be matters of public record and agreement. I think we are seeing in the UK economy right now that ownership matters in our old carbon-intensive sectors. We've seen it in relation to the closure of the threatened closure of Scunthorpe Steelworks, which was taken over by the UK government. We've seen it at Grangemouth, where a collaboration between a privately owned petrochemicals energy company, ENEOS, and the Chinese state-owned PetroChina shut down one of Scotland's crucial sites. But that is also true in wind energy too, and it's particularly true in our fabrication yards, which are crucial to employment in producing wind turbines. We're currently lacking in developed fabrication sites in Scotland, and actually the most developed turbine site we had was at Campbelltown, which was shut in 2017, having been taken over by a Korean firm, CS Wind, who concentrates production in Vietnam. Perhaps the most iconic example of this story is the Bifab operation on the east coast of Scotland. It had 2 yards in Fife and one on Lewis and in the Hebrides off the northwest coast. Those yards have now changed ownership. They've had 4 owners in 7 years between 2017 and 2024. Most recently, a deal was brokered that involved the UK government engaging in subsidising and supporting the transfer of the yards to Navantia, a Spanish state-owned enterprise specialised in shipbuilding. We have seen some developments recently in heavy cables manufacturing, but I think we should be thinking more ambitiously than this. If we look at comparable countries in a North Sea sector that have experience in heavy manufacturing and engineering too, like Denmark, those sustain tens of thousands of jobs in wind and manufacturing, generating export revenue. I think there's 3 important ways that we could think about this, and I'll conclude on this. The first is conditionality. What should we be asking for when we're auctioning off the right to generate vast profits from our wind sector? Should we be demanding more strongly and more publicly stated conditions around the creation of employment and the development of supply chain and investment in Scottish yards? We should also be asking questions about stakes and ownership. Humza Yousaf, when he ran to be SNP leader and become First Minister in 2023, actually spoke about the fact that he thought some of the profits from the ScotWind auction could have been invested by the Scottish Government in a publicly owned stake, which would have given us control and equity to some extent, and also developed expertise in the operation of wind farms, as well as generating profits from dividends. I think we also, most importantly, need a frank balance sheet on successes and failures in the sector. To be thinking about this as a sector which is now a large part of our economy, especially in the Highlands and in the Islands, but also in former industrial areas of Scotland like Fife. We need to have a frank conversation about where wind is or isn't delivering, rather than just optimistic projections for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ewan. You've given us an awful lot to think about there, from the ownership of energy and who benefits from it, the potential of fabrication jobs, and what the role of conditionality should be. So lots to think about for our Q&A as well. Just a reminder to the audience before we turn to our final speaker to put your questions in the Q&A box, please. Last but by no means least, we are very pleased to be joined by Emma Harrick. Emma is Director of Energy Transition and Supply Chain at Scottish Renewables. For those of you who may not know, Scottish Renewables is the voice of Scotland's renewable energy industry and works to grow the sector as well as its supply chains. Emma's background is in renewable energy supply chain development with experience in engineering, fabrication and port service organisations. Having worked in the sector for many years, Emma has an in-depth understanding of the challenges faced by companies who are hoping to benefit from the opportunities presented by net zero technologies and their projects. And in her role at Scottish Renewables, Emma works collaboratively across the sector through engagement with stakeholders and participation in groups. So I shall turn over to you, Emma. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Miriam and Future Economy Scotland for having me here this evening. It's really great to talk to you all, and thanks for all of the delegates who've taken time out of their sunny evening to listen in to us today. So I just wanted to use my time on this session to sort of just take you through my role at Scottish Renewables, what Scottish Renewables does, and also our role as cluster manager organisation for the clean energy cluster. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. And also just to talk to you a bit about the supply chain itself. I spend a lot of my time at Scottish Renewables talking one-to-one with lots of different businesses who are working in the renewable energy sector and working in offshore wind, and their insight is fantastic. It's something I'm really passionate about, the sort of diversity within the supply chain. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of that. So To kick off, as Miriam kindly introduced me, I'm Director of Energy Transition and Supply Chain at Scottish Renewables, and my background is within the supply chain, so within engineering, port services, and working in business development across different sectors, from everything from oil and gas and nuclear right through to renewable energy. So I'm no stranger to what it's like to work in a supply chain business and try to secure work within the renewable energy sector and understand that market. So my role at Scottish Renewables is all about supporting those businesses, and Scottish Renewables is a trade association. We're a not-for-profit organisation with over 370 members, which includes everyone from renewable energy developers and industry organisations like the Crown Estate of Scotland, and suppliers of all sizes. So that's across everyone from large tier one contractors all the way through to small and medium enterprises and startups. Organisations in our membership cover all renewable energy technologies, so not just offshore wind, but onshore wind as well, and low carbon heat, green hydrogen, pump storage hydro, and all of the renewable energy technologies. We've got a great team of policy and communications experts and public affairs experts at Scottish Renewables. And I lead the energy transition and supply chain team, which, as I said, is all about championing the growth of the renewable energy supply chain. So we work quite collaboratively across the sector, and some of my comments actually will echo Kateryna's points from earlier, which is helpful. And we work with other organisations like the enterprise agencies and the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. So part of my role is also, as I said there at the beginning, around the clean energy cluster. The clean energy cluster is Scotland's offshore wind supply chain cluster, and I just wanted to share a little bit about that. The clean energy cluster was launched in January of this year. Scottish Renewables was appointed by SOEC, the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, to lead and run the clean energy cluster, which is Scotland's offshore wind supply chain cluster. That so far has over 600 members, which represents over 400 organisations, largely made up of supply chain businesses, who are all looking to grow in the renewable energy sector. They may already have a foothold and already be delivering work in the sector, or they may be startups or businesses who are transitioning from other industries like oil and gas and looking to harness the opportunity that is coming from offshore wind. So the goal of the cluster is essentially to foster innovation, enhance business development support, facilitate knowledge transfer, and boost the competitiveness of Scotland's renewable energy supply chain. So just moving on, this will echo a little bit about the sort of context that Kateryna said, which was really useful, but I wanted to sort of paint the picture from the supply chain perspective of what the opportunity is for these businesses in Scotland and in the UK. So we know that offshore wind presents Scotland with the biggest economic opportunity that many of us will see in our lifetimes. It's a sort of green industrial revolution scale of activity. And the sector's come quite a long way from where we first started and first started deploying offshore wind. The renewable energy sector in Scotland is actually employing 42,000 people in Scotland already. And as Kateryna had mentioned, the future pipeline is quite mind-boggling. It is enormous. There is a lot to come through that Crown Estate Scotland's ScotWind leasing round, with more through the innovation and targeted oil and gas decarbonisation leasing round. But not only that, there's wider activity going on across the rest of the UK, from the Celtic Sea activity and also across the world, as other countries around the globe look to decarbonise their energy system, create energy security and tackle climate change. So suppliers are looking at this world through this lens of this really exciting opportunity, not only in Scotland, but also for export potential. Where can they take their services and skills into international markets across offshore wind? And there are lots of barriers to deploying offshore wind as well. So whilst we have this really exciting pipeline, and Kateryna touched on this as well, that there are some blockers in the way to building out this pipeline, and that's one of those things that can cause question marks for the supply chain. They're looking at this pipeline and they want to harness the opportunity. And one of the key things for supporting them is unlocking some of these barriers, which include things like the consenting process, and make sure we are streamlining that process and speeding that up so that they, as a supplier, have that clear perspective of that clear pipeline. They know what is going to happen when, so that they can prepare. And that's also about creating that investor confidence so that the supply chain can actually not necessarily just investor confidence in the projects, but investor confidence in the supply chain so businesses can invest in their skills and their capabilities and their facilities. We also need to unlock the grid. We want to be getting our green electrons from where they're generated offshore to the homes and businesses that use them through transmission and distribution infrastructure, and making sure that those projects have that grid connection is really key to unlocking that pipeline. And of course, the supply chain itself, they are completely crucial to building these projects. Everything from the design and the construction and installation through to the operations and maintenance require such a vast array of skills and know-how from the supply chain, and they are absolutely essential to the build out of these projects. So supporting these businesses to grow to enable this pipeline is really important. We can see that sort of industry and government is already working, on tackling these barriers to provide confidence to the sector and the supply chain, and that's all been led by the UK government's Clean Power 2030 Action Plan, which is paving the way for the clean energy system. And as Kateryna mentioned, we have the SSEP and the CSNEP, all the acronyms. I'm sure we can give you an acronym cheat sheet after the session. And we also seen industry initiatives like the Clean Industries Bonus, which is again about supporting sustainable supply chains, and the creation of the National Well Fund. And again, as Kateryna mentioned, the 300 million, which was a really positive announcement from Great British Energy. And that's just at a UK level. In Scotland, we have the Scottish National Investment Bank and the enterprise agencies all delivering work to support the supply chain, and of course the 500 million that is from the Scottish Government to enable the offshore wind supply chain. And from that, we've actually seen some really great announcements within the supply chain recently. So there is lots of great things happening. So I'll just give you a little bit of a flavour of some of those recent announcements that we've seen. One of the first ones was 20 million from the Scottish National Investment Bank within XLCC's cable factory at Hunterston, which is actually set to create around 900 jobs, 200 of those being apprenticeships. That also has further funding from other means. And we had 10 million from the Highlands and Islands Enterprise for the Port of Nigg to develop its Inner East Quay to expand its renewable energy activity. And High also awarded 5 million to support the Scapa Deepwater Quay project as well. And then we've seen further money from Scottish Enterprise from that 500 million pot, around 3.2 million, which was awarded to the Montrose Port Authority to expand their renewable energy capability. And at Montrose, we're also seeing investment in skills academies and capabilities there in terms of investing in the workforce. So there's actually quite a lot going on at that sort of public-private investment level to enable the supply chain in Scotland and maximise the opportunity that we're seeing from offshore wind, which is great to see. And so in the face of the challenges I mentioned, we're also seeing the wider supply chain invest in themselves. So if we look at businesses across the country and SMEs, a lot of them are essentially rolling up their sleeves and putting their hand in their own pocket to invest in their businesses and their skills, their capabilities, and their facilities to maximise this opportunity. There are hundreds of suppliers who are essentially adopting a bit of a healthy risk appetite. They've seen the potential in the pipeline and they want to go after that. So they're deploying this sort of entrepreneurial spirit to harness the business opportunity that is coming from the industry. And I also want to make the point that these businesses, and when we think about the supply chain is much more than just the large scale manufacturer. All of that is great, but there is a wider supply chain that goes along with it. The supply chain is much more than wind turbine generators and foundations. There are opportunities throughout the whole project lifecycle and through all the contracting tiers, from tier one large scale contractors and transport and installation, all the way through to SMEs and startups, and of course our ports, who are the linchpin of delivering offshore wind ambitions. And it does require a vast amount of skills and know-how, and that is everything from architects and lawyers and engineers to civils contractors for onshore work. That also includes mooring specialists, so that's something that's required for floating offshore wind farm, and that's a huge energy transition opportunity for those who are in the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector has a wealth of experience in Scotland managing and working in harsh, deep water environments, and those skills are perfect for transferring over into the floating offshore wind sector, and that covers things like the moorings for foundations. You also then move on to smaller companies who are looking at parts supply, things like switchgear and heavy handling specialists. People also looking at waste management, blade recycling, and also doing drone testing and inspection, and then all the way through to those who are supplying the catering and the hotels for all of the workers that are going to be in a particular area for delivering an offshore wind farm. So the sort of economic activity that surrounds an offshore wind farm is vast, and that all trickles down throughout the whole supply chain. Essentially, the supply chain is the sort of grassroots of the economic growth that comes from an offshore wind farm. And these are businesses that are community based. They are investing in the local people, in the local workforce, and in the local skills. And many of them also run ESG programs looking at how they can impact the local community, where they'll work with the local skills groups and they'll work with local schools to encourage careers in renewable energy, and they'll invest in that community. So there's so much going on at that supply chain level. One of the pieces of work that we deliver at Scottish Renewables essentially to try and paint a picture of what is going on in the supply chain and what it looks like is our annual supply chain impact statement. So that the sixth edition of that was just published last week. And essentially it's a snapshot of these businesses that are driving forward the sort of net zero nation. And the sixth edition spotlights 39 ambitious companies who are representing more than 9,000 jobs in the sector. That does cover all technologies because there's a lot going on across the space. And as part of this, we asked our members sort of a few questions to gauge their sentiment on the sector and how they were feeling about renewable energy. We asked them about the most pressing challenges that they were facing, and the sort of top answer for the pressing challenges was that navigating that uncertain policy landscape is the most pressing challenge for their business to scale up within renewable energy. However, on a positive note, what was great to see was that 64% of businesses are already investing in their skills and their capabilities and their facilities and spending money to grow their business and develop so that they can harness that opportunity that is coming from the pipeline. With many others already looking to plan to do that with ambitions to grow in future. So that is a great positive note from that, and the case studies within showcase that diversity of the supply chain. It's also supported by a number of our developer members who give us an insight into the work that they are doing in terms of the economic impact that their projects have within Scotland. So one of our sponsors is EDF Renewables for that publication, and they shared some information about their Nairn offshore wind farm. They selected Eyemouth Harbour for the operations and maintenance space for that project, which is employing at the moment around 27 employees, with much more to come throughout the operations phase. And that doesn't count all the construction roles for that project, but it's just a small snippet of the sort of activity that's going on at Eyemouth as a result of that project. And one of our other sponsors for that publication was Ocean Winds, who let us know that as part of their work for their Moray West offshore wind farm project, they've awarded more than 64 contracts to supply chain businesses in Scotland. So it just gives you a flavour of the sort of economic impact that is coming from offshore wind activity throughout the supply chain. So I will sort of wrap up there, and essentially I think it's pretty clear that this SME community, the wider supply chain, that opportunity in manufacturing is a key driver of economic growth and maximising the offshore wind opportunity. But there are quite a few hurdles that we need to jump over that I mentioned in terms of consenting in grid, and there are some wider regulation issues and challenges for the supply chain themselves as well. But I will leave it there because I know we want to have plenty of time for Q&A, and I've gone on for too long.
Thank you so much, Emma. No, that's really helpful, and it was helpful to hear about the challenges and opportunities you set out, and also particularly elaborating on some of the kind of skills transition around where it is kind of compatible for oil and gas workers as part of the transition, where we may kind of reach more kind of hurdles along the way there. So it's really, really helpful to have highlighted that. We now have 15 minutes for our Q&A session with the audience, and thank you to the audience members for submitting their questions. We have quite a few questions and not an awful lot of time, so I am going to ask that you answer nice, short, snappy responses. I'm going to ask each of the questions in turn, and I'll hand over to yourselves to see who might want to answer them. Some of them may not be applicable to everyone. But so yeah, firstly, we have a question on locational pricing. So Interested to hear the panel's thoughts on locational pricing. Could it support the development of offshore wind supply chain in Scotland, and what would the impact on generators be? Would anybody like to take that one first?
I can maybe kick off, not promising to give you a precise answer, however, just maybe sharing some thoughts on the topic of the location margin pricing. Obviously, very aware of this debate. It's very much ongoing, and I guess it's out with the direct remit for Crown Estate Scotland to be involved directly in terms of our role. However, the impact of the decisions on that will very much have an impact on the projects and their competitiveness, and subsequently on the decisions in terms of the investments. So obviously, this is a decision for the government, but it is very much is linked to the overall, I guess, transmission charging, which we've seen historically, and I've referred to this earlier, disproportionately impacting Scottish projects just because of where they are and because of the electricity system and the transmission charging regime was designed for the non-renewable coal-powered system. So I think this is, as I say, in terms of kind of whether it's good or bad, we're hearing various views on this in terms of investors and developers. It's not a good thing, but ultimately what we need to see the outcomes of that is that it does kind of look at the projects in and around and how the impact what it has on those investments. So I'm sure there'll be more on that, and I think we expect a government's decision later this summer on this. So we're all kind of eyes to that.
Thank you so much. Would anybody else like to come in on the locational pricing? Emma, I think you're ready.
Yeah, just jumping a little bit. I think it just actually relates to one of the surveys I mentioned in terms of the thing that's creating sort of apprehension from investors. So our impact statement showed that the suppliers, the one thing that is causing them a barrier is an uncertain policy landscape. And I think that's the one thing that this proposal on the table is creating, is that uncertain policy landscape. Sort of benefits to zonal pricing haven't really been clearly articulated or demonstrated, so it's hard to see the impact this will have. So what that's doing is creating this investor apprehension from the investors themselves, but also for the supply chain, and it's something that would take a long time to implement. So, a radical shake-up of the system is adding that apprehension in there. So I think that's what we're seeing from our members, is just a nervousness around how is this going to impact things, and that is the challenges that is causing this nervousness.
Thank you. Ewan, would you like to come in, or shall I move on to the next question?
Just a couple of short things. I think that the first thing to say around this, I think it's very important that we recognise that the parts of Scotland that are going to be generating our increasing volumes of our renewable energy into the future have borne very, very high electricity and larger energy prices for a very, very long time. And that has a legacy in the oil and gas industry where, you had houses in Shetland paying enormous fuel prices, living in fuel poverty off the gas grid that could see Sullom Voe, Europe's largest oil and gas terminal, from their window. And I think we're seeing a legacy and continuation of that in the patterns of pricing and energy use around renewables, where the same locations broadly are going to be at the centre of offshore wind development and landing that electricity on land. The other point I would like to make is the commercial industrial impacts of electricity pricing in Britain are disastrous at the moment. And that is part of the manufacturing jobs crisis we're seeing developing at the moment. And we should really be thinking about how we use the benefits of energy abundance in areas that have access to high volumes of offshore and onshore wind power to generate new industrial activity at beneficial prices.
Thanks so much. Brilliant. Okay, so we'll quickly move on to the next one because I'm conscious of time just now, but we have a question centred on community ownership. So how do you situate the possibility of community-owned onshore wind energy to offshore? Is the latter inevitably more corporate And shouldn't we be prioritising onshore community ownership as well? Who would like to kick us off?
Again, I can start off, but I'm not too sure. Just to clarify, so obviously there's community ownership, I think, within the onshore wind, but we're talking about offshore, and some of the projects have certainly looked at that sort of community ownership of offshore wind turbines, for example, as part of the offshore wind farm. So it's certainly something that if that is kind of what the question is about, I guess how do
I
we
think it's
kind of
around
actually move into
whether
that
it's viable around
space?
offshore wind.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think the scale is a bit of a challenge because obviously the offshore wind projects are really large compared to onshore, and kind of where they are and how they're regulated, and how the kind of the route to market is as well. It's I guess it's quite different. However, certainly some of our projects within the ScotWind portfolio and INTOG as well, some small innovation projects are looking at those community ownership models for offshore. And so there's relatively early stages for that. However, it's certainly something that's being considered because for all the kind of points that have been made, communities, we need to have these communities on board, and we need to see them being kind of like positive about these developments and also benefiting. So that is just one model, I guess, how they can benefit from offshore winds, but there are undoubtedly others as well, less kind of direct involvement.
Great. Ewan, did you want to come in
I
there?
guess I wanted to highlight that when we talk about community ownership, that might take different forms, but one example is actually municipal ownership of wind farms and solar farms, which was seen in North Ayrshire amongst other parts of Scotland. I guess the other thing I think we could think about, it's going to be difficult for a small scale community or even local government to fund something as large as offshore, but when we're talking about conditionality and we're talking about localized benefits, there's no reason that couldn't extend to forms of equity ownership and portions of developments being owned. I do think the current system of community benefits are inadequate from that point of view. That actually, why shouldn't this come down to communities being given the chance to own a portion even of these large developments, which are going to be benefiting from accessing their land and going through their territory, being a large part and disturbance and presence in their lives. And I think that is one thing we should be thinking about when it comes down to the conditions on which wind farms are licensed.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Emma, did you want to come in on this one, or shall we move on to the next one?
I think Kateryna and you have covered that perfectly.
Thank you. So we have another question that's specifically for Kateryna. So some have argued that because the SCDS contractual remedy payment is relatively small, so a maximum of around 250,000, this means that developers haven't got a kind of incentive to fully deliver on supply chain commitments in Scotland. They could just kind of essentially pay a fine and find cheaper suppliers outside of Scotland. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's fair? And I suppose looking ahead at the next round of ScotWind, is that something that might be reviewed?
Thank you for this question. Certainly, yeah, no, I can see that kind of on the surface. It's it's very much valid in terms of, I guess, direct financial penalty compared to the value of some of these projects and the investment required. So, however, that was very much designed with a view to look at kind of longer term picture and to make sure that these penalties fit in and around the Scottish market. But also, it's only one aspect of the whole kind of SCDS supply chain development statement process and how we work with projects in making sure that their commitments from the outset are actually delivered throughout and they stick to them. So this was introduced, as I say, at the very outset. Companies have made commitments, and these are publicly, obviously, published. As I mentioned, the Outlook statements are published on our websites. There is a huge kind of reputational leverage there as well. These developers have gone out and they've said that this is what they would do. So there is that leverage that we're also using, but also actually working with projects throughout that development phase and making sure that they're actually getting involved in things like these collaborative forums like the SIM, this Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, and other levers there. I guess it's only one kind of sort of part of the, as I say, overall picture, and it wasn't necessarily meant to like really heavily penalize projects, which are indeed, as we mentioned, do have a number of challenges along the way throughout that development phase, and they need to be competitive as well in the UK and global market to be able to succeed.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. So we have a question here around the role of a potential Scottish publicly owned energy company. Is this a solution to developing and ensuring Scottish offshore wind manufacturing? And drawing on the point that Ewan highlighted earlier, actually around the role of foreign government-owned companies in Scottish waters and offshore wind. I'll maybe hand over to Ewan this time first.
I think it has to be on the table. It has to be taken seriously and considered. I think what we've seen in the last few weeks and months is that ownership of our economy of crucial industrial sectors has become an issue that's back on the table. It's being taken seriously, and what we saw at Scunthorpe and also then failed to see at Grangemouth is how consequential those sorts of decisions can be. And that doesn't only apply to older carbon intensive sectors, it also very, very strongly applies to the new and increasingly important sectors like wind that we all rely on. If we want to see the maximum economic benefits from wind, I think that has to consider a serious portion of public ownership. GB Energy was partly founded, in the words of the current Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, so the British people could own things and make things again. And I don't see why it shouldn't be supporting the option of a Scottish publicly owned energy company.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to come in on that? We've got a couple of minutes if so, Kateryna.
Yeah, just to add to Ewan's remarks there, obviously, yeah, GB Energy is already, I guess, an example of the state-owned energy company, and they've made kind of, as we referred to it, these commitments, and they will continue to, I guess, invest in supply chain, but also projects. So that's the sort of one model at the UK level to do that on behalf of the state, I guess. And obviously, we've got the Scottish National Investment Bank within Scotland, which has that the powers to invest in the projects as well. So ultimately, it's there's various models. We at Crown Estate Scotland, we have a engagement with GB Energy as well. So we're discussing at the highest level potential opportunities in terms of working together for the benefit of the certainly Scottish industry. So yeah, whether we need something else, time will tell. I guess we can explore this once. Yeah, we can see what happens with, I think, GB Energy first of all.
Okay. Emma, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's an interesting point to explore the different models. And, you know, as Kateryna said, there's sort of different other offers on the table, and I outlined some of them at the beginning in terms of the investment we're seeing. So I think it's the importance of that collaboration and that public-private collaboration of bringing programs together. So you have inward investors, but then you have things like the Scottish National Investment Bank and the Scottish National Wealth Fund, and even products coming from UK Export Finance to unlock the private investment to grow a supply chain and create a manufacturing facility here. So I actually think it's almost like a layer cake of all of these different elements coming together to unlock that investment and grow the supply chain. So I don't think it's one size fits all when it comes to that either. I think every different potential opportunity will need different mechanisms to unlock.
Yeah, just final point, just thought came into my head, and ultimately what we need, and I referred to this earlier, we need these projects and the supply chain companies to be competitive. So we need the private sector to be interested and be able to invest. So yeah, it's good to have leverage from the public sector and co-invest, but it shouldn't be sort of one solution. It should be very much, as you say, Emma, that public-private, I think, investment and opportunity there.
I think though there's the danger of public subsidies, private profit, and also the fact that as things stand, the Scottish supply sector has not been nearly as successful as it was projected to have been under the current model of private leadership. And I do think we need to take that seriously.
Yep, agreed.
Okay. That is sadly all we have time for. I'm sure we could have continued to speak for hours on this topic. There is so much to cover within it. But for now, I just want to say a huge thank you firstly to everybody for coming here, for our audience, for coming and joining us on what is a genuinely stunning sunny evening. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come here and particularly those of you who asked questions as well. I also want to say thank you to Sam, who's been our events manager. Sam has coordinated all of the IT for us this evening. If anybody that you know would like to have joined this evening but wasn't able to make it, we will be putting up a recording of the webinar on our website in the coming days. And a huge thank you of course, to Kateryna, to Ewan, and to Emma for joining us this evening. We are really, really grateful for this timely and important discussion. Finally, one plug, we have another webinar coming up in a few weeks' time on labour market transition, so do keep an eye out for that as well. But yes, thank you so much and have a lovely evening, everyone.